Georgie opening it up, yeah?
Georgie's opened up.
Oh, it has. Okay.
I think.
Yes, I have. We can go ahead.
Perfect. So welcome, panelists, to this second Advanced Therapies think tank. Very excited about this conversation, obviously. I'm wondering, there's been some recent announcements recently. I'm wondering about your take on this most favored nation pricing idea, for instance, right? This idea that somehow the U.S. has both borne the cost and borne the cost of return on investment for drugs. What do we make of this idea?
Happy to start first, Lee.
Yeah.
I think I think let's maybe take some facts, starting with some facts. I think if you look at majority of pharmaceutical companies and their products that span globally, not just the US, I think it's a fact that a significant percentage of their revenues and profitability come from the US market. There's no argument there. And in some cases it's 70, 80, 90% of their revenues and profitability come from the US market alone. So I think that in itself can be further dissected and seen that, yes, that is probably what is driving a most favored nations, or MFN, as we here in the States like to call it, sort of thought process, or perhaps that as a tool to try to create an equilibrium of costs. Because obviously in the US, the government, although they're dipping their toe more into this, does not really negotiate prices for medications. So to create a reference point to say, for example, if the UK or if Germany or Denmark or whatever, the price is X, then let's use that as the reference price for what the US should be looking at, right? And then create either some penalties or what have you, some additional discounting that the manufacturers would have to provide back to the US payers, for example, especially the government. And that's the notion, right? So I believe if you think about this, the question that really comes up is that, what are manufacturers going to do about this? If these European governments, for example, or other governments all throughout the world are going to negotiate a very significant discount, does that cause a dynamic where these pharmaceutical manufacturers say, you know what, we're just not going to sell in France. We're not going to sell in other markets, for example, and to try to protect the price, because again, the concept that overwhelming majority of their profits and revenue come from the US market. So how do we protect the US market? How do we go at the price that they need to go at to maintain the business case as well as future innovation? And I think that is to me the biggest question mark. Are we now going to see limited access of medications because of this most favored nations approach?
Sorry.
No, sorry, Claudia. I was just going to say, I think this is very much what happened in Europe with Bluebird Bio, where they couldn't come to an agreement with the German reimbursement agencies, and they decided to withdraw.
That's exactly right.
Sorry, Claudia.
Now that will stimulate a little bit of the tourism, on medical tourism, and in that sense will be kind of difficult to control.
I mean, it's notoriously difficult to control already, right?
Yeah, I was going to add that there was already a reaction by most manufacturers' CEO a couple of months ago in Europe, asking the European Commission to have more reasonable framework for including and adopting new therapies, because it was getting more and more difficult for them, and they were even sort of threatening to, bring some of the money they're investing in R&D in Europe back to the US, and that's related to tariffs as well, but it's somehow related to this discussion as well.
I mean, I know we're moving more towards isolationism and less globalism, but it seems like the logical move would be to say, let's create a global body which negotiates drug pricing, no?
Yep.
Well, that would be the ideal, but already, as you say, we're seeing more isolationism and tariffs and things like that. So to even expect that kind of collaboration on something as sensitive as drug pricing, where often in the US it's seen as more of a business, where in Europe it's almost a bit of a dirty word if you're charging a lot for a drug that's potentially life-saving. So.
And what's interesting to you is by the sounds of it, US still isn't negotiating drug pricing. It's just relying on everybody else to negotiate drug pricing. Is that, do I have that wrong?
I think that's right. I think the issue that you have in the US is that you have, in essence, two payers. You have the government, and even that is very fragmented with the different states and local
Mm.
governments that have the ability to negotiate. And then you have the private market, which is the other 50-60% of the population, right? And the private market, they negotiate at an individual organizational basis on as it relates to price. I mean, there's a set price that drugs come out with, but then there's sort of discounting based on all sorts of variables and such. And I think that's the issue. And the government itself, or government related insurance or health coverage, is looking at starting to put price. I'll use the term negotiations. I'm not sure exactly if that's what it's going to be, or setting a price that what the government will pay. But even that is just more of a pilot. We're going to try it on 5 medications, 10 medications, and see how that works, right? And not the thousands that are on the market today in the US.
Wonderful, dear. Thank you very much. Well, definitely, I think a topic for future advanced therapies think tank discussion. Really, really exciting, but a very much a developing environment. So welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see everyone joining us here, and welcome back to Advanced Therapies Think Tank, or AT3 as we like to call it. We're really, really excited you're here. This is our second session. If you are new to us, Advanced Therapies Think Tank is a solution-based platform.
It's just me being a bit of a...
if Michelle could go onto mute, please. This is a solution-based platform for experts really across the advanced therapies ecosystem.
The notes that I shared, that was through.
Right, that's wonderful. Sorry about that, everybody. So as I said, Advanced Therapies Think Tank is a solution-based platform for experts all across the advanced therapy ecosystem. And this hopefully allows us to tackle those really big challenges head on. The goal here is we skip the primers and we dive straight into the real questions, and we go deep very, very quickly. And we do this because we know you're already working in the space. You've already got that basic idea. We don't need to explain the basics to you. We need to get down and find out what the problems are so we can start thinking about solutions. Each episode is built around a single pressing topic, and we bring together expert voices from industry, payers, regulators, and patient-facing roles, with the real aim of challenging the assumptions that are out there and to create real actionable ideas for people to take forward. Our faculty, as always, we are very, very grateful for, and they help us to shape these discussions throughout the season. And we'll also close every session with takeaways. And Lee has joined us here to take those notes and be able to help us support some takeaways. Those of you that were with us last month, Audrey hosted that last session on delivery and access. And so today we're moving all the way to the other side of the equation, and we're looking at pricing. So current cell and gene therapy pricing strategies really appear to be very opaque and shrouded very often in mystery, based on a variety of often confidential factors. There's an enormous amount of variability in how prices are set and what drives those discussions. And those discussions are normally held behind closed doors with a very small group of people. So, whilst we don't yet have the ability to listen in on those discussions, we do realize there are a number of factors that developers will consider when setting a price, and there are a number of levers that can be pulled by payers when agreeing or not agreeing. These then need to be accepted or rejected by those payers, resulting in that additional negotiation, often whilst patients are desperately waiting for treatment. So today we're going to begin with exploring some of these levers available to developers in defining a price, how they use them to convince payers that they are reasonable and fair. And armed with that knowledge, we'll then begin to explore how we as an industry can bring about more clarity into what is driving these often very, very high prices. So I'm very excited to have joining us faculty and panelists. So today our faculty members are Angie Miller and Claudia Zilberberg, and our invited guests are Catherine Akerson, Dia Balazi, and Hector de la Riviera Dominguez. So in our discussions today, Hector, Angie, and Claudia will be representing perspectives from the developer's side, and Dia and Catherine will be talking about the payers. So this allows us to really cover all the bases as far as we can over the next hour or so. Throughout the session, please do use the chat and the reactions functions to engage with the panel and with each other. We will be monitoring the chat as well as the Q&A. We really, really want this to be a collaborative, interactive session, and we want to know what you think. We also do have time allocated for audience Q&A, so if you do have those questions, please put them down and submit them, and we'll be able to get to them just closer to the top of the hour. Right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. Why do cell and gene therapies cost what they cost, and what goes into that very often exorbitant sticker price? Claudia, I'm going to start with you. From the developer side, what are the key ingredients of price construction? Do they include cost of goods, R&D, market value? What are the things that really drive those big numbers?
Thank you, Sven, and thank you all of you for this opportunity to talk about this important subject. And this is a great question to start. You know, the pricing for cell and gene therapy is quite unique. From the developer side, the cost per patient is influenced by several factors and key components, and is not a simple markup. As a matter of fact, it reflects a combination of economic, clinical, and strategic factors. So some of the breakdowns is, for example, cost of goods. The cost of goods of manufacturing, given the complexity, is sometimes quite high. We have raw materials, viral vectors, reagents, media, labor, which require high skill labor if it's not automated yet system, at least for autologous. The batch size often is one patient, one batch for autologous therapies. The QC testing, which is really a high percentage of the cost of the cell therapy, and the manufacturing scale and platform, if it exists, autologous versus genetic. So sometimes autologous costs of goods can vary between $100K to $300K per patient or more. Then you have the R&D costs. Then you have the R&D costs of preclinical, clinical trials, regulatory pathways, and failures that needs to be accounted. Small number of patients inflates the pricing. And the market value pricing, just to finish up, this is where actually the cost comes from. For example, if one-time therapy replaces a $500K year chronic drug, the developer might price it at a $2 to $3 million. So there is a lot of variables, as you can see, you know, the clinical benefits, the comparison cost, and the quality adjusted life years gain on this, we call QALYs, and the willingness for the payers to pay these amounts that can balance the equation. And I will stop here for a moment or give the space to others to add to this subject. I think we lost Sven.
Oh,
I
no.
think so too.
So, who else can chime in here on adding to Claudia, who did a nice job of summarizing the cost drivers? Does anyone have anything to add to the drivers of pricing?
Leah, I just want to overemphasize what Claudia mentioned around the development piece, right? Many CGTs or cell and gene therapies, they're not developed in a let's call it accelerated way where it's just a few months of research and they're going for regulatory approval, right? These are years and years of research, years and years of trial and failures, to which costs, in many cases, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, especially platforms. And I think that's also a big part of the pricing dynamic, that is a recoupment of that investment, so that the developer can continue on with the next, either whether it's using the same platform for a different disease state, or identifying a new one, right? And I think that's another significant aspect, and that's not specific to CGT. It's specific, I would say, across the entire pharmaceutical industry. The amount of years and time and material and labor costs to do the research and the development work is extremely significant.
And it's a very good point. And you know, that is oftentimes borne by a global organization spread across multiple jurisdictions, and yet we see, despite that, very regionally different pricing. Can someone else speak to why, even though you would think in a global organization, the spread of that R&D cost and the other factors that Claudia mentioned, and Dia has expounded upon, still result in vastly different pricing in different countries?
Yeah,
So-
if I
Go
just
on, Jay.
quickly, if I quickly just chime in here, because the UK is quite unique in having a centralized system. A lot of the time, the variation is with, for example, the discussions and agreements behind closed doors with regards to what is acceptable, because there are multiple pressures in looking at, for example, the price that you put on anything. It's not a level playing field. And I think in a way, it's almost like a black box, because so much is unknown and it varies by region. So the variation that you mentioned, a lot of the time, if you have a centralized system, so for example, the UK has the National Health Service, and Germany has a similar system. You have bodies that really do enforce and push what is acceptable and what isn't. And that does impact the price that you see, the overall price. For industry, obviously, there's the return on investment. It costs so much. The fact that a lot of these, it will have to be produced in a location near the patient because of the unique personalized aspect of the treatment that does impact it. But there is a certain cap. There is a certain level of what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, if I can
Yeah,
add,
go ahead,
Bill.
Hector. Yeah, please.
Yeah, build on that. So there's obviously a huge variation. Well, based on what Angie said, it's part of the reason, but it's true that there are many elements on pricing, and those should be common to anywhere. So it doesn't matter if I sell in the US or in Switzerland. The price should be, I mean, the elements of pricing should be the same, but the value that that drug has in every different market is different depending on the type of health system we're approaching. So we were discussing before this that US prices probably are the highest, and that's because the health system very private driven, right? If you move to Europe, where most of the health systems are public and tax funded, is a very different story, and then becomes all these conversations, all these negotiations, all these price reductions, agreements that lower prices. Yes, some countries like Germany or the UK have HTA bodies, and they have, let's say, in principle, a more objective evaluation of the value of the drug for those countries in a specific. But then, if you ask me about Europe, you have probably 27 different prices, because we have 27 different countries. This, unfortunately, is creating difficulties in accessing some CGTs. We have some examples very recently where either countries decided not to reimburse some of these CGTs, or the manufacturers decided to withdraw because they didn't see that return on investment Andy was referring to. So yes, I think we need to find a common element of pricing, because those elements that build the price are everywhere the same.
Yeah. Thank you, Hector. And sorry, we've lost our host Sven. He's had some internet problems, but we'll go get back to the script now that I've located it. So I'm stepping in for him. Catherine, picking up on what Hector was describing from the payer perspective, and specifically to CGTs, how are the prices, first of all, justified, and will that hold, do you think, or will we see an evolution toward lower pricing over time?
So, Hector, I think you're completely right. There is the complete possibility where you have 27 different prices for one asset for one indication. And I'm not even going to touch on multiple indications for a single asset because that's a whole different world. But I think when these cell and gene therapies first came to the market and payers had to make these value judgments about what to pay for, I think what we sometimes forget in the nitty-gritty is there was such a sense of hope and innovation and urgency. These were complete paradigm shifting treatments that could give a curative solution to really devastating diseases, really horrible pediatric diseases. And so payers were willing to pay the price for kind of, I suppose, 4 reasons, really. One, this curative value. Then secondly, this innovation premium. I know that manufacturers always say that they've only 1 in 10 comes to market, and that is very true. But payers will reward and acknowledge innovation. There was certainly a societal impact there about cure that was hugely important. Looking more practically, though, I think something that allowed these high prices to come to pass is the idea of complete cost offsets, the idea if you can give a one-time therapy and avoid a lifetime of transfusions or hospital stays or intensive therapies, was incredibly attractive for payer. And we, of course, had these small patient populations because we were mostly looking at ultra-rare diseases. Now, I think the bigger question is whether these 4 factors will still hold into the future, because we've seen that not all cell and gene therapies are curative. And so we're moving away from one-time administration to just delaying relapse, which is a very different thing when you're talking about price and value-based pricing. The innovation premium maybe isn't as acute as it once was at the first beginning of these becoming available. And we know that the cost offsets are not as good as we'd have hoped, partly because patients relapse and partly because people are beginning to realize that costs are in silos, and some of the cost savings wouldn't actually be things that impact on the health system. They could go to social care, for example. And as we see these move as well into larger patient populations and non-fatal diseases, I think there's a lot of conversations to be had about whether that 2 million price tag is something that is going to be sustainable over the longer term. But I will open that one up for more questions and comments from the group.
And Angie, touching on this point that Catherine made about curatives, particularly in rare disease, talked about this tension between ethical versus strategic pricing, and whether we should be entertaining ceiling on pricing, and how do companies and how do we justify value in those scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on some of it. For one, as a company, and I can see like some of the comments coming through, a lot of the technologies are coming through from academia, and particularly in the rare disease space. So to say, for a company to say, okay, I need return on investment because it costs so much to develop this technology and bring it to market, you can see it from both sides. But as for companies that are developing technologies, they have to exist. They have to be able to carry on. So in one hand, you can see why they need to recover the investment. The other is really, it's not ethical to have, for example, I can treat you, but I can't treat you because you're based there and not here. We mentioned before that there are variations on pricing. That is really related to the healthcare system, the infrastructures that exist. All that it does by actually having variations and where a rare disease is addressed better in one location than the other is where you'll have medical nomads, where you will have individuals or families chasing where they can access treatments. But when it comes to value, there are multiple issues that are considered, and they are real. It's just, should they really influence whether someone gets treatment or not? Societal impact, the spillover. For example, with a lot of these technologies, with the research and innovation that goes into and is generated through the development of this treatment, it opens the market for treatment of other indications. So you can understand that. We touched on it before, indications that before were never considered curative can be cured. It is also, when you look at, for example, chronic versus, for example, one time, if you have an intervention that can treat multiple indications, it changes the healthcare system, it changes the lifespan, it changes the whole vision for whatever population you're talking about. So you can understand the reasons why and the quality of life that that individual has. But the question is that right? Is it, should we be able to do this? Should the powers be there? And I think it's a much more complex landscape than even when we start thinking about it, that we envisage, because you're talking about the variations in disease type, class, you're talking about who can afford access to it, the healthcare systems that exist. For example, the politics that feeds in. We were talking very early on, for example, new laws that are going to come in that will impact pricing. There are so many parameters that feed into it. It's not as simple as we think.
And in a way, I suppose it's difficult to talk about CGT pricing, right? Because, you know, a rare disease is very different than a very common disease, let alone the disparities between countries. And, you know, Dia, you know, we want to be very careful not to go down the reimbursement rabbit hole, because we're going to have a whole nother session tied to reimbursement. But to Angie's point, there is this tie between reimbursement models and how we think about pricing. You know, can you talk about, you know, the impact of reimbursement models on final price, at least, you know, from your perspective from the US, but also, you know, in other jurisdictions?
Sure, happy to. The premise here, when you think about CGT and a potential curative, and I think the potential is also a key word. There's not many of these therapies out there, and we're still not 100% clear if they are truly curative. I think the verdict is still out. But the chronicity of a chronic disease is important to really fundamentally understand. And I'm going to use the example of hemophilia. Here in the US, we have 2 gene therapies on the market. Hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that uses basically what we call factor product replacement as the general treatment here in the US, as well as all over the world, to assist those, particularly children, when they have a bleeding episode, to help them clot, right? To help them stop bleeding. Those therapies here in the US can cause hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year on a maintenance and call it preventative perspective. A gene therapy that's out here in the US that might cost $3 or $4 million, if you think about it, is in essence putting a few years of what one could look at, or maybe 5 years of what the sort of traditional cost of the standard of care of using treatment factor all into one point in time, right? And I think that's the fundamental shift that everyone really needs to really understand, is that we're taking sort of a lifetime of treatment perhaps and bringing it perhaps into one point in time. And if you think of it that way, you now can think about, well, maybe we need to start looking at CGTs and allowing payers to pay over time. That's one type of model. As I mentioned earlier, are these truly curative? Perhaps the pricing and the reimbursement is the wrong place to really put focus. Perhaps it's, how can we assure that these therapies do what they say they're going to do? In other words, in the hemophilia example, if a patient loses that sustainability of that gene therapy, and they're back on maintenance of factor products, et cetera, for bleeding episodes, is there a return back to the payer? Is there in essence a guarantee or a warranty that could be provided back to say, if our therapy does not work after a certain period of time, then we are willing to give something back, right? Because it's that was perhaps not the right therapy, or this is an outlier in the treatment of or the use of that gene therapy. So I think these are the models that we really need to start thinking about, because here in the U.S. we don't negotiate price. The price is set by the developer, by the manufacturer, and we're then determining whether everyone should have access. Is it limited access? Do we ask for discounts perhaps from the manufacturer, et cetera, based on those prices? But I think the way we look at this in terms of how do we pay for it? When do we pay for it? Is there a warranty? Do we pay over time? These are some of the things that are being heavily looked at today as for some of these cell and gene treatments.
Could I jump in there, Lee, for a second?
Sure. Yes, please.
So I think what you're speaking about is uncertainty, dear, and I think this is something that is the certainly in Europe is kind of the bedrock of how payers will assess something. I think you're right, the jury is still out on whether these are curative treatments. I think we've definitely seen circumstances where they haven't been curative treatments, and so a payer will be very reluctant to pay £3 million now when they don't necessarily know what they're going to get at the end. And you've also got to realise that payers go on annual budget cycles. So £3 million now versus £100,000 this year will take a lot of money away from other treatments that won't necessarily get that. So, it's always a case of you have to rob Peter to pay Paul, if you can use that analogy. There is no never-ending annual budget. And so, as you say, the way we deal with this uncertainty, because you're never going to expect a clinical trial that will run for the life of a patient before you bring a product to market, that would just be ruinous, is do we have outcomes-based payment agreements? Do we have modular-based payment agreements? Or do we just take a blunt instrument to it and say, I will give you £1 million and no more, because that is the data that you have presented to me. These are the uncertainties that I have in front of me. And this is the decision that I will take today, because it's ultimately all based on the value at the time of assessment versus the price that is requested at the time of assessment.
It's a very good point, Catherine, and Hector, I'd like you to chime in here on how maybe the pricing models outside of the US in other countries, North and Latin America, for instance, Europe, might factor that in, making it easier or more difficult. I mean, what's your take on this?
So, I mean, there are many things that Catherine already said about it. It's very different to have a drug that is promising to cure, a very life-threatening disease, or even a disease that it's going to have a huge burden on the patient on the long run. Because it's difficult for the payer also to say no, even if the price is very high. So the experience is that outcome-based models have been tried in Europe in many countries in terms of, let's see if this drug that it does what it say it does. The difficulty here is that it might work for the first 4 years, that they don't know if they're going to work in year 10, right? And we're promising it's going to work forever. So there's also this balance, or do we continue paying for a therapy of a patient that was treated 10 years ago, 10 years later? That's a question that we need to answer. And secondly, it's not only about the manufacturer. What we are seeing is that once we achieve this outcome-based models, and also paying in different installments in different years, or even paying back if the therapy didn't work after 5 years, that has already been tried. But that it also implies a lot of burden on the accountancy of the payers, right? They don't know how to handle these payments in the first place because of taxes, because of, as Catherine said, I mean, we have a yearly budget, and you are somehow telling me that I need to adapt my next 10 years budget to pay one therapy for one patient. So there are many things that are being fixed as we treat patients with these cell and gene therapies, these outcome-based models. I think we are now mature enough as to understand whether what's working well and what's not working that well, and linking that also with the supply chain efficiency, which has been a huge element of difficulty to achieve those outcome-based models for some, especially cell therapies. And from the side of the payer and governments, how to pay and how to adapt their budgets in order to adapt this.
I think that's a great cue for us to move, into you've done a wonderful job of explaining kind of the rationale and the drivers for pricing, some of the terrible complexities we have to fit CGT curative, long-term curative outcomes potentially, if the evidence supports that, in existing models which weren't really built for that. We have a serious access problem as well, as Angie has pointed out, and that's a topic for a future session. But I'd like to shift the conversation now to the second line of questioning, which is, what can we do today to improve pricing strategies that will work across multiple healthcare systems, products, and geographies for tomorrow's patients? Are there many models or learnings from these multiple ecosystems that we all work in that we might use as a reference? And Claudia, I'll start with you. Are there immediate reforms that you can think of that you've seen that could improve pricing transparency and predictability? Of course, as has been pointed out, the predictability of pricing is dependent upon the predictability of outcomes. But what are your thoughts about immediate reforms that might aid in our analysis or strategies around pricing?
Well, it's an excellent point. Predictability, transparency between developers, hospitals, and patients, be able to speak the same language, the same economic language is great and important, and building the trust that is important with payers and the healthcare systems. So the estimated cost of goods, the ranges are usually very acceptable. People should know about it. There should be disclosures on the R&D investment, so you understand what is at stake. The comparison between therapies and the cost of sets and the assumptions behind this value-based pricing. So the building the trust is one of the first blocks of this important part of it. Then you have to standardize health economic models globally. That's the way it may work, how the budget impact those models, how the cost of sets in the 5-10 years, as everybody mentioned here. In the era of AI, predictability is increasing when all the parties speak the same economic language and understand what the model will work. Public registries, which is something that I think that could be an interesting element of value-based agreements, will create centralized, even if it's anonymized, registry of performance and outcome-based contracts, payment over time models, payer-developer risk frameworks. I think that this will accelerate the adoption and the standardization and create new creative methods of payment. At the end of the day, we need to streamline the coding and reimbursement pathways, and that is not only in the US, it's globally, and perhaps standardize that, and create site of care payment structures, reform fast-track coding decisions, not to be forever, to create codings and for approved CGTs, and require CMS to issue payments, guidance, and so forth. Reduce the guesswork for hospitals and payers and do more, create predictability is very important. We have the elements technologically to work on that. So I think that real-world evidence will mandate tied to pricing and will require post-market data sharing and see how the real-world evidence of the effectiveness holds. and link that to ongoing reimbursement being more dynamic, not necessarily one box fit all. So this makes a high, perhaps upfront cost, but it's just justifiable because the real outcome is in the value that we are looking for. So there are a lot of elements you guys talk about, that because the real world comes with a promised cure, could be a long-term remission. So you can, if failed, get a rebate, or or the payment stops and the price is adjusted. There are many different ways to work on that. So
thank you,
thank
you, Claudia. That's a great list of provocative ideas, and I think one of them is this idea of potentially investing more in real world evidence and registries. And I think it's a topic that we'd like to revisit with the think tank, in a future session. And I want to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned, Angie, and point it over to you. Claudia talked about, better, more transparent, more clear coding. But before we get to coding, do you think there's a mechanism for building multinational frameworks around either life-saving versus life-curative, or life-improving versus life-saving treatments, or frameworks around indication-based pricing? So if you're looking at this kind of disease, this is a framework for pricing. Have you thought about this at all?
Yeah, and it's a tricky one. It is, as a model, it does answer some of the questions. Well, some I mentioned, because the thing is, it is so complex. And when you think about it at face value, yes, maybe if something is going to really save your life, extend your life, you have, it's basically your life is not going to be cut short through this treatment. Maybe it should be priced differently to something that really is going to improve the quality of your life. And that's one of the questions. It does bring in a lot of ethics and what is right. How can you put a price on something like that? But when you look at pricing to try and simplify it and create more transparency, it does make you question, there is some value in having an indication-based model. So for example, looking at maybe the severity, patient subgroups, expected outcomes, looking at things like that to help provide some clarity in how you can price a particular indication. What complicates it, though, is the fact that the globe is not uniform. Indications are not uniform. Individuals are not uniform. The infrastructures that are there are not uniform. But it does have some value. And I think really it's not going to be one model that's going to address these things. And also the decision-making, depending on where you are, we've touched on it before, the healthcare systems are so different globally that it's going to be something more complex. And it's really, I think, to have anything that's indication-based and really looking, okay, because of the parameters, and we said the variability, how would that be policed? How would you govern that? How would you say, for example, this is effective and that isn't, particularly in the absence of long-term data? So we touched on real-world evidence. That's going to change things. I mean, when we have a good body of data for a lot of these treatments, it's going to change things, because depending on what model you have, it could be that it changes it completely, that it's not a complete cure. It gives you additional time, but doesn't cure anything. There are so many, every time I think that I'm coming close to, yeah, it should be this, there's something else. There's another parameter, and there's another aspect. And this is why it's something that we have this conversation maybe next year. It may be very different.
I think thank you, Angie. You've done a nice job, and I think one of the takeaways that rings true to me is that is something that Claudia mentioned is perhaps being more I think these are all cost drivers that pharma considers and insurers consider, but maybe the mechanisms by which those are considered aren't as transparent as they could be to build that public trust. And I think that's something I think I'd like to pick up on in future sessions. But Dia, I want to pick up on this and flip to you. And I don't know why we keep assigning you the payer reimbursement questions, but it really what role do payers need to play in pushing for more innovative pricing? And then obviously payment models for CGT that don't exist today, but you think probably are going to need to exist for the different kinds of both costs of CGT production and research and also the value created by their long-term impacts.
Yeah, it's so first off, I think the payers should be pushing for unique or different or new payment models. I think it's important. It's important, frankly, just for sustainability. Here in the United States, we see payers challenged by this because of the fragmented payer market, I should say, whether it's government payers, individual companies who have employees, to health insurance companies, et cetera. There's just a number of different small, mid, large, thousands of them, if you will, that create this fragmentation. What we've seen in the CGT, and again, it's still new, it's obviously still early, but the demand, again, as I mentioned earlier, more around what if the product doesn't work? How do we deal with that? We have seen some trial and error on can we pay a multi-million-dollar gene therapy product over time? I think that's unique, that's different. But again, to all of these things, the challenge, especially in the US, and it's probably even more analogous to EU countries where you may be a patient may go from Germany to France to Spain and different payers, and now who's responsible and so on and so forth. We have that in perhaps in a more exponential situation here, is that a health insurance payer here in the United States might pay $3 million for a gene therapy for a patient, and that's no longer their patient next year. It goes to a government payment model, or goes to another health insurance company, or someone else that's managing that individual's health expenses, et cetera. And I think these are the complexities of this, and the fragmentation makes this even more challenging, right? And I think what we've seen over the years, and this is sort of the yin and yang between the developers and the payers of sort of this contention. I call it healthy contention that's necessary. There needs to be more open dialogue, more coming to the table to try to work through these issues, because the sustainability piece, especially in the United States, where price is not really a negotiated dynamic, the healthcare budget compared to GDP just continues to increase year over year, which is just not sustainable, right? We're becoming a health economy than anything else, and I think that is something we need to work together on the developer, on the manufacturer side, on the payer side, on the policy side as well, to really try to create the sustainability model. Because at the end of the day, innovation has to continue. We can't have manufacturers and developers stop producing new treatments and therapies. That will be disastrous. So there has to be a way to continue to allow innovation, to figure out how we do this. And the best way to do that is for these different stakeholders to come together and really try to work together to figure this out.
Yeah, fascinating. Catherine, I'm curious, we love to think that we're terribly unique in cell and gene therapy. In many ways we are, and we love it. But, there have been other complex medicines brought to market in rare diseases, oncology, and that are tricky to deliver, costly to make, costly to invest in. What could we learn about what these, specialty pharmacies, for instance, what can we learn from these predecessor products and treatments that we should be applying better than we are?
That is a very good and a very complicated question. So I think rather than try and spread my net too wide, I will probably focus on some of the oncology biologics and then on rare disease in general, because that's something that feeds so fundamentally into where we are with cell and gene therapies. So I think certainly one of the things from oncology that payers grappled with before cell and gene therapies kind of became available is this idea of surrogate endpoints and fast approvals. So I think an argument around PFS versus OS and a trial that doesn't have overall survival as its primary endpoint is not 1,000 miles away and has potentially paved the way for these acceptability of cell and gene therapies where you have, in a way, surrogate endpoints. I know they're not surrogate because they're measuring something such as success of graft. It's not completely analogous to just a tumor and its response, but I think those kind of things and being able to go through regulatory approval on phase 2 single arm studies, that kind of thing very much paved the way for being able to flex to the innovation of cell and gene therapies, because certainly for European payers, they will have frameworks for value and price relationship, and being able to show where those areas of flex are has been really important. And I think as well with rare disease, to take the UK as an example, we have the highly specialised technologies pathway for NICE in the UK, which is if you are an ultra rare disease, the willingness to pay for that therapy goes from between £20,000 to £30,000 to £100,000 just by the nature of being an incredibly rare disease. And a lot of products had success on the HST pathway that they would not have had on the standard pathway. And I think that a lot of that is just because of the shortfalls you have with really, really rare disease, that you can't actually show benefit in the same way as you could do in a diabetes or a cardiovascular disease. And the thing that I think is interesting looking forward is that I feel like some of the cell and gene therapy indications are on that threshold, if I can keep the UK analogy going, of being no longer within the highly specialized therapies pathway. They will have to go through this on maybe a non-ultra rare pathway with all the challenges and the higher expectations for data and the lower appetite for risk and uncertainty that would be associated with. Fascinating.
That takes me to I think the last question, that I will make, and we'll turn over to audience questions. But there's a little bit of an overlap between one of the audience questions that's popped up on my radar, Hector. And the question to you is, what can companies be doing early on in their innovation, in your perspective, to drive to effective optimal pricing strategies? And the audience question that relates to that is this obsession with potency assays. So, we understand the rationale for potency assays, but they're notoriously difficult from a cell therapy perspective. And so the big question is, what can we do in early stage innovation to affect pricing? And if you have a thought on this potency question, I'd love to hear it.
So, well, I mean, it's when developing a drug, it doesn't matter if it's a CGT or any other drug. Usually, manufacturers in very early stages only focus on science, right? Efficacy, safety, pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics. I think we should be working more towards a value dossier very early on, even in preclinical stages, sitting down with patient advocacy groups, providers, payers, regulators, to better understand what's the value, real value that we want to bring to the patients, right? So with that in mind, I think in the very early stages, we can start measuring, or we try to integrate health economics, quality of life measures. So we can start discussing about not only health outcomes, but also cost effectiveness, along with all the clinical answers that we want to provide for a med need. We're sort of shifting our approach with the TPP models, the target product profile models in developing. So we're going towards that direction, but I think we should include earlier on all those elements, because we're going to be able to answer those clinical questions, but also to better understand what the HTAs, what the payers will need, and what's the value that we're going to bring to the patient. Also, another element we can work is, this is also about, how pricing, but I think, and I mentioned before, supply chain and manufacturing. I think it's a factor that is very important, especially in the beginning, because there is a very small scale to these biotechs that start producing CGTs. So working on understanding what's going to be the yield of the batches, what's going to be the turnaround times, what's going to be the scalability, I think will help also to drive the pricing strategy in the long run. And that's something that probably we need to forecast earlier on as well.
It's interesting, right? I'm stealing something Jason Foster's fond of saying, that we should be adding viability to safety, potency, purity, and viability. And by viability, he means commercial viability, right? How can we bring this therapy to market in a way which is the optimally commercially viable? And obviously that means a lot of different things to different people. Sometimes it could be just pure profit margin, but I think the proper way to think about that is viability, not only in terms of margin, but in terms of patient access, in terms of access across different healthcare systems, across different socioeconomic stratifications, et cetera. So one of the audience questions that's I'm picking up on that we visited very briefly is, with all of this regional disparity in pricing for the same drug, how do we think about cross-border access? Are we going to be in a situation where it's a free-for-all, where patients will just travel wherever they can get, or wherever they can get the therapy the cheapest? Or insurers will even push, for that? Or are there going to be restrictions put on patients accessing these therapies in places where they don't live or have residency, for instance? Thoughts about the global access to these therapies and the regional disparities in pricing. Catherine, maybe I'll start with you.
That's a difficult one. I mean, I know from a human level that it happens. I don't think from a UK or a European healthcare system perspective we are prepared for it at all. And I'm not sure I can say much more than that, really. I mean, countries and the way they work within Europe are so country-centric. Their numbers are all based on them. I don't really think there's any meaningful policies or frameworks for medical tourism. International reference pricing, yes. The pricing can be standardized with a basket of looking at what other countries are doing, but there's nothing out there officially. If, I wanted to take my little girl to Italy to get something that she wouldn't otherwise get. It's a human factors thing, I think, which
Anybody
almost
else
makes
want to?
it more powerful.
It's very true. It's very true. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, if I can add on that, Catherine is right. So within Europe, you can do it. So you can travel from one country to another to get treatment if it's not available in your country. But the country that it's going to treat you, imagine that you come to Spain because we have the drug, but you come from Croatia, that they don't have the drug available there. So first of all, you have to set an agreement between the two governments, so that the Spanish government makes sure that the Croatian government is going to pay for the drug, and then they will pay for the drug at the price that Spain is, selling the drug. So there's still, yes, it doesn't, let's say, it's not a free of charge traveling across the world. So you have to set a framework where the country that's treating the patient actually is putting their rules up front, and is the other country that has to adapt. And that's okay for therapies that are not, let's say, very urgent, but if you need a CAR T, probably you're not going to have a chance if you have to fulfill all this.
And Dia, the take in the US obviously on that is very different. I mean, what's your thoughts on the I guess the impact of price disparity in medical tourism?
So in the US, medical tourism, drug importation, I'll kind of put them in a similar basket. Happens somewhat, and I use the term often, perhaps maybe as much as 5 to 10% of the population is dabbling in this, perhaps. But we're not seeing this in CGT. We are seeing this in other specialty pharmaceutical treatments where patients will go to Central or South America, or will import medications from Canada, for example, because they're half the cost, or whatever the discounting variability might be. So I think it's we're seeing this. I'm hearing more employer groups, in other words, companies who have thousands of employees, for example, or hundreds of employees who are dabbling in this to try to get some of their patients on very expensive therapies and treatments, whether it's imported from Canada, sending them, even paying for their travel to go to another country to get these therapies. There's anecdotes of these types of events every day. You hear this every day.
Yeah.
I just don't see cell and gene therapy is just a different model, right?
I disagree. I think we're seeing it. I mean, I think we've seen
Yeah.
it for a long time in orthopedics, right? We've seen it for a long time in hair transplants through cellular PRP, that sort of thing. And I think we're going to see it very soon in CAR T, if we're not seeing it already, with CAR Ts being brought to India for a tenth of the cost. Brazil is working on their own system.
My point when saying it's different, Lee, is that you have to go to a facility, hospital, clinic that's going to provide this, that's approved to provide this, that has the technical expertise to do this. It's, I think, a bit more complex than doing a hair transplant, or maybe even more complex than doing a hip surgery or a new knee or something to that effect. But again, I think to your point, it's already paved. We see this happening in all sorts of different areas, but it's hard to say. And access to these treatments in Central America, for example, may not be as readily accessible. Right? I mean, these therapies are not going to be there, at least in the first 50 countries that a manufacturer might want to launch into. It's going to take some time to be able to get access to these types of therapies. It's a bit of a it's not as easy as my point.
It touches on a thank you, Dia. It touches on a related question. I'd like to point to Claudia or Angie to answer, or both. And that is, we hear about, even within the US market, with which I'm the most familiar, the cost of having to relocate your family from a smaller city to a center of excellence for 3 months, and that could be more expensive than traveling to India, right? Outside of even the product price. How do we factor in the cost of the travel to a center of excellence, for instance, for some of these therapies? And hopefully we're moving away from that with some of these therapies, and we're moving them into the community healthcare setting, which is what we talked about in the first session. But to the extent that that's still required, how do we factor in those costs in the pricing?
Those costs, I believe, are part of a payer-patient relationship, mostly, not necessarily the developer. But I think that the point of having now different countries liking to have their own cell and gene therapy, their own CAR T, and so forth, will create an issue for the developers to take care of and see how they can handle that at the end of the day. But in terms of the expenses of moving patients from even centers of excellence or cities where things are happening right now, even in India or even in Latin America, definitely something that it's compounding to the pricing as well, and needs to be something that the payers need to look into it. So the decentralization is going to be critical and a big step forward for this.
Thank you, Claudia. And Angie, I think we'll have to wrap it there. I really appreciate this tremendous conversation, and having taken over from Sven as host here, I'm not as prepared as rapporteur to have a list of the takeaways, although we will put that in our summaries and notes after the session is over, but certainly this is a complex conversation where there is a lot of regional diversity. I think for me, some of the takeaways have been the need to have more transparency about how price is determined, that's critical to building more trust in the biopharma model across modalities, for sure, including cell and gene therapies, but also that there's more that we could do with respect to proving out the long-term outcomes of these therapies, and that real-world evidence in that regard will help us provide more certainty around the value, which will provide more certainty around the pricing, which will provide us more clarity around the payment models, perhaps, that we could use for these going forward. I want to thank all of the panelists and the audience for your engagement. A huge thanks to our sponsor, BCA Advanced Therapies Network, for supporting the think tank. This session is just part of a much larger conversation. Obviously, we need each of you to carry it forward, and we will have related sessions on reimbursement, cost of productions, registries, etc. going forward. CGTs hold the promise of a great transformation, but without affordability, the promise obviously remains out of reach. So if you want to follow future sessions or contribute your ideas, please make sure you've subscribed to advancedtherapiesthinktank.com or follow us on LinkedIn. I'm sure it'll come as no surprise that to all of you that reimbursement will be featured on the calendar very soon in an upcoming think tank session. And until next time, challenge convention, build transparency, and let's get these therapies where they belong, into the patients that need them. Thank you all very, very much, and have a good rest of your day.